I explained to you yesterday exactly what it would sound like if anybody were craven and morally corrupt enough not to call out Donald Trump's lies about paracetamol and autism, and how dangerous it would be for public discourse and even the population for public figures not to simply describe the idiocy of an idiot. And it happened this very morning in this very studio. You had in real time and glorious technicolor somebody refusing, for reasons that we may actually explore later in the programme, to call a spade, to describe an idiot as an idiot, and to condemn in the strongest of terms Donald Trump's dangerous lies about paracetamol and autism. And
we've previously analysed the terminal damage caused when public figures lack the moral fortitude to challenge the hazardous myths peddled by Donald Trump. To ignore blatant medical fallacies is to invite a collapse in our shared reality. Yet, this very morning, we sat in this studio and watched someone, in vivid detail, refuse to call a fraud a fraud. They simply couldn't bring themselves to condemn the indefensible. Now, before we pull back the curtain on why this shift is happening, please do support our work by subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Your engagement ensures we can keep providing these deep dives. It is easy to scoff at Nigel Farage's relevance, but his influence on how we perceive truth is profound. Consider the global stage. A few years ago, the UN met Trump's arrogance with laughter. Today, that laughter has vanished. It's as if a nation was handed a repeat exam. They had the same evidence, the same criminal history, and the same textbooks of misconduct as 2016. They were given a chance to redeem their judgment, but instead they chose to walk back into the same fire.
And it's important. You may think it isn't. You may be wondering why on earth we would pay any attention to creepy Uncle Nigel. But it's important because of how public discourse shifts. And rarely will you see more compelling evidence of how public discourse shifts towards the lies and the liars than Donald Trump's speech to the United Nations yesterday. Last time he stood in front of those people and made nonsensical claims about his own magnificence and achievements, they actually laughed. They laughed in the room. They're not laughing now, because if you think of elections as exams, a population is being examined. A friend of mine made this point on social media earlier today. Then the last election in the United States of America was a resit. That they got to resit the 2016 election. They got given all the same information, all the same revision aids. They got given all the same textbooks, all the same insights, all the same evidence, all the same information, and they were given a chance to redeem themselves, to say, do you know what? We're probably not going to elect the self-confessed sex offender, serious criminal, fraudster, whatever the list you prefer today is. Remember though, he's a leader, not a lawyer. This time round we're probably not, and they made that mistake again. They made it in the strongest of terms, and that's why it's not funny now when he stands up in front of the United Nations and essentially claims that the moon is made of cheese and that he made the cheese. Essentially makes claims that he has delivered things on a scale that is inconceivable, incomparable. It's incredible, right? But it's not funny. And I spend a lot of time trying to unravel things that are initially quite complicated. Yesterday was a very good example of that. It was a brilliant phone-in yesterday. I'm so grateful to you. The number of answers to the question of why is Trump doing this latest lie about autism, they were varied and compelling. Everything from the sort of master race rhetoric of not wanting, if there is autism in his own family, not wanting it to be some sort of genetic inheritance, right through to the bodily autonomy of women, to trying to undermine healthcare, to desperately trying to paint targets on the back of neurodiverse people for the distant day when people get a little bit bored of attacking foreigners, or when there aren't any foreigners left to attack, just coming up with a new ism, a new minority to other and to attack. And they could all be right. The final caller yesterday in the first hour was essentially saying, I think everything that we've heard so far is true, and here's something else as well. So you can sometimes you can be rewarded for overthinking things. But I listened to a tiny bit of Trump's, well, I listened to some of Trump's speech yesterday, and there was one bit of it that I wonder whether we need to almost start underthinking stuff. Could you make me a list now, or send me a text now, of people in public life that regularly and prominently describe racism as racism and racists as racists? The columnists, the commentators, the broadcasters, the newspaper editors, the ones who actually call out racism. Think of, what was that fella's name? Was it Frank Hester? The guy that said he wanted to shoot all black women whenever he looked at Diane Abbott. Still in post, still, I presume, giving money to the Tory party. Absolutely sort of disappeared after a little bit of brouhaha. I can't, off the top of my head, think of prominent public figures who routinely, I suppose Gary Lineker did it a bit, I continues to use his social media platforms to provide a voice to the voiceless. But in terms of two teams, if you were to assemble two teams, people on this side are constantly saying, oh, you can't say anything in this country anymore without being called a racist. Some columnists, I always get them mixed up, but it's either the Daily Mail or the Spectator, have columnists who call it racism, like two words, Ray, R-A-Y, and then, because, you know, it's really funny, racism, and people who describe it and call it out and witness it, people who get killed because of it, that's all laughs, that's all just bants, that's all hilarious. So we'll come up with it. But it's so ubiquitous. The claim that there is no racism, the claim that when people are treated differently because of the colour of their skin or because of their origins, it's not racism, and anybody claiming that it is indulging in political correctness. So make your list now, seriously. So who have you got on the other side? You've got pretty much everybody working for the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, GBB's, all of Farage's outfit, all of them, constantly poo-pooing the idea that racism even exists. Who's on this side of the fence? Who are the really prominent public figures with big old platforms who call out racism? Who can even remember the name of the bloke that said he wanted to shoot all black women whenever he saw Diane Abbott, big shot donor to the Tory party? Who's on the list? Weird, isn't it? It's really, really weird, because there is a feeling, if that's the right word, a conviction even, perhaps, abroad, that, and by that I don't mean overseas, I just mean in the ether, you know, in the shared environment, that it's the other way around. What do they say about the devil? The devil's greatest achievement is convincing you that he doesn't exist. So the racist's greatest achievement, in many ways, is convincing you that racism doesn't exist, or that there is this politically correct army, this woke legion of people with real power and big jobs and massive microphones and newspaper columns who are constantly calling out racism. But you can't name any. Oh, you can't name three. Isn't that crazy? That is absolutely crazy. And I thought it when I heard Donald Trump reference political correctness in the course of his speech during an attack upon our democratically elected triple-time Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. And I thought, well, who are the people that... What are these forces of political correctness? You can't turn your telly on these days. You certainly can't turn on this radio station without hearing a massive racist going largely unchallenged with all sorts of lies and nonsenses. But you don't have to interrogate those nonsenses too closely, because we're not having an election for 4 years. So, you know, it's far too early. So why are you interviewing somebody if it's too early to start digging into what he's actually saying? It's a question for the ages. You can't open a newspaper without encountering racism. You can't go onto social media. You certainly can't go onto Twitter without encountering racism. So where are these forces of political correctness? Where's the woke army gone? Well, I mean, all of these people that they're so terrified of. They tried to cancel Jimmy Kimmel. That didn't work out. We may get onto that story a little later, but that's on the other side of the Atlantic. How is it happening here? Who are these politically correct warriors? Isn't that crazy? Have you noticed that before? I hadn't. Not in this very specific context. There aren't any. There aren't any. And yet, the racists argue constantly that they're up against some manned barricade of do-gooding celebrities. It suddenly makes sense of why somebody like Gary Lineker or Carol Vorderman comes in for unconscionable amounts of abuse, because there isn't anybody else to go for. There are so... And they're not even using their paid work to promote their opinions. They just had the audacity to do stuff for free on social media. Where are the columnists? Where are the commentators? Where are the presenters who are part of this army of anti-racist wokeness or political correctness? Here is the President of the United States of America telling lies about the most electorally successful city mayor in the history of this country.
I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible mayor, and it's been so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law, but you're in a different country. You can't do that.
That's a lie that was doing the rounds on social media 10 years ago. In fact, the original clip or the original quote described it as Shakira law. And we used to laugh about that. And we're not laughing now. Because when the most powerful man in the world tells lies like that, it matters. You might not want it to matter. You might wish that you can, of course, put your fingers in your ears and look the other way. But that matters. That is a hideous lie being told about the greatest city in the world. And I listen, when he comes on the show, I tell him. There's lots of things I think he could have done better as Mayor of London. There's no such thing as a perfect politician, not by any stretch of the imagination. But the first thing you've got to do is win elections. And he keeps doing that. And if he lost, I'll tell you something for nothing, he wouldn't lie about it. And he certainly wouldn't encourage a violent mob of murderous fantasists to launch an attack on City Hall, baying for the blood of Jenny Jones, or even that dreadful woman who told fibs about being robbed on the London Underground. I mean, these are just self-evident truths, and they are simple. And we have sat here saying, for a long time, what is going on? And sometimes it's really, really simple. It's really simple. Sometimes it's just racism. And those of us who are, quotes, politically correct, end quotes, or, quotes, woke, end quotes, are very nervous of using that word. You can see what happens when an accusation or an allegation is cheapened by overuse. We see it a lot with anti-Semitism, which is a real and ugly reality for Jewish people, but is not remotely linked to criticising Benjamin Netanyahu for undertaking a genocide in Gaza, or indeed for marching through London in solidarity with the people of Palestine. There is nothing remotely anti-Semitic about either of those things, and yet people will insist that there is. So there is a nervousness, perhaps, about using racism as an accusation, and yet people who are very often racist adjacent insist that they're constantly being accused of it, to which my question becomes, by whom? By whom? Who is accusing you of racism? Who are the prominent public figures who are still fuming about the Tory donor saying he wants to shoot all black women every time he sees Diane Abbott on the telly? Who are the prominent public figures who routinely gallop to the defence of our fellow citizens when they're attacked by foreign leaders with lies? Where is it? So, my question for you today is simple. When Donald Trump tells lies and attacks Sadiq Khan in this way, is it anything other than racism? He wants you and me and anybody not brown to be fearful and suspicious of everyone who is. That's it. That is the game. That's the mission. That's the plan. It is very, very simply racism. And I don't know why we're frightened of saying so. Oh, they eat swans as well, these people, these foreign people. And they eat dogs and they eat cats. And why don't you make those claims about people who aren't foreign? Well, because I'm a racist, is the answer. And when Steve Bannon said, you need to embrace the accusation of racism, I wonder whether the reason that didn't land and didn't work is because the accusation is hardly ever made. It's quite weird reading people like Rod Liddell or Richard Littlejohn, and I'm told that some people still do. They live in a world where they're constantly being accused of racism. And you wonder, by whom? Who is constantly accusing you of racism? One of them lives in a gated community in Florida for most of the year. What has he got? People marching up outside his locked gates shouting racist through the bars. Where are all these people? What is this army of anti-racist warriors? They don't exist. If it does, I'll tell you for nothing, it's a very lonely place to be in the UK media. So that perhaps is why Donald Trump is attacking Sadiq Khan. That perhaps is why we're not calling it out. Because they've created this mythology of political correctness where you can't say anything in this country without being called a racist. And then you say to people, what do you want to say? And they say, I want to say racist things without being called a racist. I want to judge people according to the colour of their skin. I want to extrapolate from the criminality of one person with dark skin, suspicions and accusations against all people with dark skin. If a crime is committed by somebody that I've lied about, being an asylum seeker, I think it is perfectly reasonable to go out or call for people to set fire to hotels full of asylum seekers. It's insane, right? But is it just racism? Is today the day, or is today a day, when we do whatever the opposite of overthinking is? Underthinking sounds a bit inadequate, doesn't it? Sometimes there are simple answers to simple questions. London without immigration would be dead within an hour. It's so obvious and so self-evident that it shouldn't even need saying. You cannot be more integrated as the son of immigrants than to be elected mayor of a country's capital city. That is literally the gold standard. What is your definition of successful integration? Well, I don't know, maybe Dick Whittington came from the Midlands, got elected mayor of London. That's a pretty good... Yeah, exactly. So two people come over to this country from Pakistan and their son grows up to be the mayor of London. That's it. That's integration. You don't have to rate him as a mayor. You just have to acknowledge the reality of that moment. Donald Trump's parents, or his grandparents came from foreign countries. He gets to be president of the United States of America. That's a wonderful example of integration, but he's white. So nobody ever claims he's trying to introduce medieval laws. It's a complete lie. It's a complete lie. And that brings us back to Farage, who apparently knows it's not a lie because a taxi driver told him, which makes you wonder what other of his worldview, what other parts of his worldview can be traced back to conversations with taxi drivers. I dread to think. The Queen's a lizard, maybe? Taxi driver told me that must be true. Reform policy, apparently, is going to be built upon conversations that Nigel Farage claims, because we all know his relationship with the truth is at best strained, claims that he's had with taxi drivers. Who here doesn't recognise that as the most wonderful way to formulate opinions and policies? Why do we need universities? Why do we need schools? Why do we need books when we can just talk to a taxi driver? Some taxi drivers I've spoken to over the years have been incredibly insightful and incredibly bright. I hope he's listening. I think particularly of Dave in Shepherd's Bush. But I don't think Dave in Shepherd's Bush would expect me to base all of my opinions on everything, including something as important as a racist lie being told about the Mayor of London. I don't think he would expect me to base that on a conversation with him. He may even have been pulling my leg. If I was a taxi driver and Nigel Farage got into the back of my taxi, I'd be tempted to tell him that there's a Sharia law centre just around the corner. But that's not the point, because even if there was, it's a lie to claim that Sadiq Khan has ever expressed any interest whatsoever in doing it. If he was introducing Sharia law, he'd be in the dock for attending Pride, you could argue. Not just attending Pride, but leading Pride through the streets of the city where he's been elected mayor 3 times running. So it's just racism, right? It's just racism. And it's everywhere now.